And thank you everyone for coming. It's really nice to see you all here. So the talk tonight will pretty much be 3 different sections. So first I'll talk about cancer and cancer data. Then we'll look at the Australian Cancer Atlas, its key features, some of the key findings. And then finally, we'll examine what it actually means for you personally. And prepare to engage because my talks tend to be interactive. Just to be really clear, so cancer can be used in a range of contexts. And tonight, when we say cancer, we're not actually talking about the Tropic of Cancer. We're not talking about the Marvel Universe character called Cancer, nor any zodiac signs, nor any star constellations. Instead, tonight, we're going to talk about cancer. And so this is interactive question number 1. What is cancer actually? So can everyone clap your hands twice together? Perfect. So you can select any of these options by clapping twice after I read it out. And you can select as many as you like. So is cancer abnormal cell growth? A scary diagnosis? Around 100 distinct diseases? Okay, great. You guys did super well. So 100 distinct diseases, absolutely correct. Scary diagnosis, whatever you said is correct because that's kind of personal opinion. But the first one, abnormal cell growth, is actually only partially correct. So that's really the definition of a tumor. And tumors can be benign or invasive. So a benign tumor is abnormal cell growth, but it can't spread into neighboring tissues. However, they can actually be quite dangerous. A benign brain tumor could actually be life-threatening, whereas other benign tumors can actually even morph into an invasive tumor sometimes. An invasive tumor, it can spread throughout the body, and that's what we actually call cancer. So cancer is abnormal or uncontrolled cell growth that is capable of spreading throughout your body. And although cancer is often considered to be a modern plague, it's actually been around for quite a while. So it's another interactive question. Could everyone hum, please? That's beautiful. So I'm going to say 3 different things. And if you believe cancer has been found in them, please hum after it. Again, you can select as many options as you like. So has cancer been found in Egyptian mummies? Dinosaurs? Naked mole rats? Okay, so maybe not quite as well on this question, but the correct answers are Egyptian mummies and dinosaurs. And so dinosaurs, cancer has actually only been found in the one pictured, which is Edmontosaurus, but benign tumors have been found in other duck-billed dinosaurs. Naked mole rats, they're actually a creature that's alive today. It's a small rodent. It lives for a comparatively long time for its size, and they've never found cancer in any of them. In fact, researchers are investigating why these animals are so invincible when it comes to cancer. So cancer in humans in Australia is one of the few diseases that we have practically complete incidence data for. I'll use incidence and diagnosis fairly interchangeably tonight because they mean the same thing. And so if someone's diagnosed with cancer in Australia, details on that are sent to the appropriate state or territory cancer registry. Because cancer is such a severe disease, almost every case is actually detected. And the cancer registries then compile their data by sending it through to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, and they create the Australian Cancer Database. So in Australia, how many cancers are actually diagnosed each year? So for this question, you can knock on your desk twice. Yep, you can do a trial run. Everyone can knock on their desk twice. See how it goes. Okay, great. So you can only select one option this time. So it ranges from between 50,000 to 145,000. And all of these numbers really do represent a lot of lives and a lot of suffering quite often. So knock twice if you believe 145,000 cancers are diagnosed in Australia each year. 130,000, 100,000, 80,000, 50,000. Okay, so the correct answer is actually A or B. I'll give it to you. So 145,000 are the estimated numbers for this year, but 130,000 is the most recent data that they have released, and that's from 2015. The others all represent earlier years. And so what that means is that within my lifetime, the numbers of cancers have actually tripled in Australia. And that could look like a really scary increase. But during that time period, the Australian population has also increased in size and number, and it's also grown older. And cancer is often more diagnosed around older people, among older people. So if we actually adjust for the population growth and the age differences, then you can see that yes, during the 1980s and 90s, cancer was increasing in Australia. But since about 2008, cancer has actually been decreasing in incidence. Or has it? If we actually separate by sex, and here males is the blue line and females the yellow line, you can see it's been noticeably decreasing among males, but among females, it's still increasing. And so this shows how digging into the data a little bit deeper can actually give us more insight, and that's kind of a key theme in tonight's talk. The other thing to note about males is that in the early 90s, they had that real spike in incidence, and that's been attributed to prostate-specific antigen or PSA testing being embraced. And so that's just a simple blood test they can do. It can help detect prostate cancer a lot earlier. Prostate cancer is the most common cancer diagnosed among men, but there's a lot of controversy surrounding it. It's not the most specific or sensitive test possible. But this shows how changes in screening can dramatically and suddenly change incidence rates of cancer. Whereas if there's population-wide changes in risk factors, like smoking, say, that can take decades before it actually sees the influence on incidence rates. So what causes cancer? So last year, this paper was published, and it was a UK study that looked at people's beliefs about causes of cancer. And they found that a surprisingly high number of respondents did believe things like microwaves, stress, electromagnetic radiation, and even drinking water from plastic bottles could cause cancer. Now, some of those are not the healthiest things to do, but there's no substantial evidence they actually cause cancer. And it can be quite confusing. I think this cartoon kind of nicely encapsulates the cycle of people reporting stories in the media that might subsequently be revised or retracted. And it just becomes quite confusing to know what's actually reality and what is fake news. And so here, for instance, we could have daycare causing breast cancer among rats. But Cancer Council actually runs a website called iheard.com.au. So if ever you have a question about a cause of cancer, you can go to this website, and if it's not already published, you can submit your question and have it answered. And the actual gold standard for determining causes of cancer is actually the International Agency for Research in Cancer. And they trawl through all the scientific evidence available to categorize whether something is carcinogenic or causes cancer or not. And so these different groups of main interest is group 1, which are considered to be carcinogenic to humans. And you can see they found 120 agents that there is enough evidence to say they actually cause cancer. Now, in this group, there's a variety of things. There's a range of infections. And so this is another interactive question. So which of the following do you believe cause cancer? And so you can clap twice for your responses. Again, you can select as many as you think are appropriate. So who believes human papillomavirus, or HPV, is a cause of cancer? Influenza virus, hepatitis B virus, Epstein-Barr virus. Okay, great. So all of these are correct except influenza virus. But of course, generally with viral infections, it would be a chronic infection for it to actually result in cancer subsequently. There's additional infections mentioned in group 1 carcinogens as well. But there's also a lot of exposures to different substances. So that includes things like tobacco smoking, air pollution, ultraviolet radiation, wood dust, asbestos, even things like diesel fumes. It also includes things you eat, so alcohol or processed meat or salted fish, and it includes a lot of chemicals. But one disadvantage of this system is that it doesn't mention kind of when you don't do things that cause cancer. So things like physical inactivity or things like not eating many veggies. Now, these are definitely shown to be associated with a range of cancers, but they're not listed in the group 1 carcinogens. But, you know, research has shown that 1/3 of cancers are potentially preventable. And so if you consider that we actually have 145,000 cancers diagnosed in Australia this year, that's potentially almost 50,000 might be able to be preventable through changing like diet, exercise, being sun smart, avoiding tobacco and alcohol. So it's quite mind-blowing, really. And Australia's had a lot of effort in actually trying to prevent cancer. So they've been pioneering a lot of things around tobacco legislation, so including smoke-free spaces, excessive taxation, and of course the plain packaging, which has now been taken up by many countries. And apparently cigarettes from plain packaging actually taste worse than those in branded packaging. Who would have thought? The other thing is cervical cancer. They've put a lot of effort into through extensive vaccination campaigns, but also screening programs. And of course, melanoma is a big issue in Australia, and they've invested effort in that as well through banning solariums and also iconic sun smart campaigns. Can everyone name the 5 SunSmart components? Can you yell them out? I'll start. SLIP. Yep. Seek. And last one? Slide. Yes. Brilliant. Thank you, down the back. So it is slip on sun protective clothing, slop on sunscreen, slap on a hat, seek shade, and slide on your sunnies. But you know, melanoma remains among the highest in Australia in the world. And if we look at the age standardized rates, you can see it's been increasing over time. So does this suggest that the whole SunSmart campaign has been a failure? Well, if we dig into the data by looking at by age groups, this is from a published paper, just using Queensland data, and each of these lines represents a 5-year age group. The top graph is males, the bottom is females, and the x-axis is the birth year. So the older ages are to your left, younger ages are to your right. And you can see in older ages, it's been increasing, middle age kind of plateauing, and younger ages actually decreasing trends over time. So the conclusion from this paper is actually that the SunSmart campaign has been incredibly effective in Australia. So yay, Sid. So we've seen how digging into the data by looking at age differences, by looking at sex differences can really help enlighten us into what's actually happening. But what if we wanted to look at different geographic areas in Australia? So if we assume Australia is square, and each of these dots represents a cancer case, you can see we have a lot of cancer cases in Australia. And if we divide into states and territories, we still have very high numbers. We can calculate rates. We will get solid estimates. But as we go to finer and finer resolution, we reach a point where our data becomes quite sparse. And normally, if we're trying to compare between different areas, we'd calculate a rate called a standardized incidence ratio, or SIR. So we have the observed number of cancer cases divided by the expected number. Now, the problem when we have sparse data is that we have areas that have no cancer cases. So that has an SIR of 0. And if there's people living there, we probably would not expect that area to actually have a risk of 0. The other thing is the expected count is closely based on the population in each area. So if it's quite small, for an SIR of 0, it makes no difference. But if we have even 1 cancer case diagnosed in that area, we can get huge SIRs. So this is saying the risk in that area is 5 times the national average, or a 400% increase in cancer risk. But it's only based on 1 cancer case. If we had 2 cancer cases in that area, it becomes 10-fold increase in risk, or 900% increase in risk. And that just sounds astronomical. So if we actually map these kind of raw SIRs, then we get maps like this. And here we have red and orange representing high incidence, blues representing low incidence, pale yellow is around the average. We have these extra white areas, and they are representing SIRs of 0 here. We also have oval inset for Brisbane, a rounded rectangle for Sydney, and a circle for Melbourne. Now, this is using simulated data for reasons I'll show later. So you might think, well, it's just when you have really rare cancer types, it's not that bad normally. But if we look at some published ones using similar size areas, this is for prostate cancer. So the most common cancer, and here gray represents rates they consider to be too unreliable, so they've suppressed them. So you can see it covers a vast part of Australia. And so really, if we're going to produce estimates at this kind of area level, we need to do something different. And the problem is in Australia, it's just such a difficult country to do small area estimation in. And it's because of our sparse population. So this map shows the 1 square kilometre density population grid. And so as at 2016. And grey represents a population density of 0. So you can see across most of the country, we have almost no one living there. That makes it really difficult. The areas we're interested in are statistical areas 2, or SA2s. And you can see how in more inland areas, they are a lot bigger. So there's a lot of range in land size. So it goes from less than 1 square kilometre up to the size of Spain. We also have wide variation in our population estimates in these areas. So some of them have no one living in them. Others have almost 73,000. And the median's only around 5,800 people. So the modelling that we're going to do to ensure we can actually get accurate rates at this kind of level is Bayesian models. And Bayesian models are really a very intuitive way of looking at the world, because most of our decisions are based on our prior beliefs and experiences. So here, if our interest level is represented by our circle, and say we're interested in the Australian Cancer Atlas, and then we have a good experience with it, we find it really easy to use, and then we are potentially more interested in it afterwards. Conversely, if we're interested in the Australian Cancer Atlas, but we find it difficult and clunky to use, then we're less interested in using the Australian Cancer Atlas. And so all the Bayesian model does is to actually quantify these kind of probabilities. And so we can put a prior distribution on our interest level, and when you combine that with our data in the form of a likelihood, then we obtain a posterior that's really focused around, yes, the Australian Cancer Atlas is worth investing my time in doing. On the other hand, if we have the same original interest level, but a bad experience, we end up with this really vague, uncertain interest in the Australian Cancer Atlas. So for our spatial prior, we chose to base it on Tobler's law. And you may have guessed this is another interactive question. So for this one, you can knock on your desks again. So you can only choose one day. So I'll give you a second to read through them so you can think carefully about which one it might be. So ready? So first one, who believes for Tobler's law, it is for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction? This is a very educated audience. Near things are more related than distant things. Excellent. If life were easy, it wouldn't be difficult. So unsurprisingly, number 2 is correct. So the first one is Newton's third law of motion. The third one comes from Kermit the Frog, but it's actually very applicable to Bayesian spatial modeling. So Tobler's law is also known as the first law of geography, and in full, it actually states everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. And so we can apply that by looking at our small areas and considering what's happening around them. So if we're interested in that green area, then we can look at the purple areas that actually are adjacent to it. And we can actually demonstrate exactly how this works by using our heights. So if everyone stands to your feet, and this also reduces your cancer risk as well because you're moving. And if you look at the people around you, if you're an island, pretend they're kind of closer than they are. And if they're taller than you, you need to stretch up. And if they're shorter, scrunch down a bit. Beautiful. So this is your height, conditional on the heights of your neighbors. And if you look around the room, you can see how some of those extreme values are kind of smoothed out. So very tall and very short people have kind of moved more towards the average. So thank you for participating, and you can be seated. And so when we apply our Bayesian spatial models, this is a reminder, this is what our raw data looked like when we just calculate an SIR. But when we model it with our Bayesian spatial term included, then it looks like this. And it looks a little bit different. So let's just look at a few areas in detail and see what's actually happening here. And all of the areas we'll look at, they are actually more than 30% increased risk in our raw SIR. So first, a very remote area in Western Australia. After modeling, it actually becomes below the national average, but it was actually only based on one simulated data case, simulated cancer data point. And the reason why we're using simulated data is purely so I can tell you these numbers, because if it was real data, I could not share these numbers with you. So the second area is a very remote area in Queensland, and after smoothing, it actually becomes around the average, but it was based on 2 cancer cases in our simulated data. And the third area is actually just south of Melbourne, so it's in that circle inset. And after smoothing, it remains well above the national average. And it was based on 13 cancer cases. So you can see it seems to be doing fairly sensible things. So we took our cancer data from the cancer registries, we applied our Bayesian spatial models, and we produced the Australian Cancer Atlas. So who's seen the Australian Cancer Atlas? Yay! So it was released almost 14 months ago, and it was a huge project. Recently, it's been really lovely to receive some awards for it. So we received the Regional Asia-Pacific Spatial Excellence Award for Spatial Enablement. And even shortly after that, we received the ACEMS Impact and Engagement Award, which is just really nice because there's some really impressive projects happening in ACEMS. Now, I may actually be slightly biased, but I do believe it is actually one of the best cancer atlases in the world. But it's certainly not one of the earliest. A long time ago, in a galaxy not so far away, To be precise, in London, 1868, when Dr. Alfred Havilland gave a lecture to demonstrate that cancer needed to be considered a specific public health concern. And what did he use to prove his case? You may have guessed, maps of cancer mortality. And rather confusingly, these maps actually have red as low cancer mortality rates and blue as high cancer mortality. Things have advanced over the time. Other cancer maps rapidly followed. So some mapped just at the local neighborhood area, and here they showed black cancer houses. It also showed a complete disregard for patient privacy. Others took a more regional approach, and this one in France actually looked at cancer rates in conjunction with air pollution estimates, which was really cool. Between Dr. Havilland's lecture and the launch of the Australian Cancer Atlas, it was almost exactly 150 years. You can do the maths, and it means that like between his lecture and my talk tonight, it's almost exactly 151 years, which is kind of cool in itself. So the Australian Cancer Atlas was looking at data for males, females, and persons. We were looking at 20 different cancer types. It was incidence and 5-year cancer survival, and it was across 2,148 populated SH2s. It was a joint project led by Cancer Council Queensland and QUT, with additional support from Frontier SI. And additional funding and cancer data were received from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, with additional support from 2 research centres of excellence, one of which was ACEMS, who is hosting tonight's lecture. So our team was composed of some incredibly skilled and wonderful people. The project was led by Professors Peter Barty and Kerry Mengerson, and our multidisciplinary team included statistical experts, cancer epidemiology experts, visualization experts, project management experts, IT infrastructure and web design experts. We also received lots of guidance and wise advice from our project advisory board, which was chaired by Professor David Roeder. So this was an amazing team to be part of. Early on in the project, we did some scoping, and we decided that we really wanted these people to be able to use the Australian Cancer Atlas. And if you look at it, it's such a diverse list. So it's public, it's clinicians, it's cancer patients, it's cancer agencies, it's media, it's researchers, it's almost everyone in the world. But I actually like to divide it and break it down a bit more into just 3 groups of Cancer Atlas users. So the first are the investigators, and these really want to dig deep into the data. The next is the researchers, and they just want to use our estimates. And the third is just your everyday curious kind of person who wants to check it out quickly and easily and probably look pretty cool while doing so. So any one user can actually switch between these roles at any given point in time. So if we actually go into the Atlas, and here we're going to look at liver cancer results. And you can see we have a map. We have additional corresponding graphs. And we're going to go to a low socioeconomic area in Brisbane. So we'll choose Inala, which has quite a reputation. And you can see as we zoom in that the V-plot actually changes to better reflect what's shown on screen. So if we click on the area, it'll pop up a box. It also highlights it on our V-plot and allows us to choose the density plot that corresponds to that area. We'll also compare this against an area really far away. So we'll go to South Bank in Melbourne. I'll repeat this by clicking on this area, and it will pop up the box for that. Also highlighted on our V-plot, and you can see just how similar those estimates really are for liver cancer. Now we're going to reset just so we can see all of Australia, and that will allow us to also compare on our V-plot how these 2 areas compare against other parts. It also allows us to re-find our box for Inala, which kind of vanished. And so these boxes are really nice and clear. They label each cancer type individually, but it's also a bit hard to get an overview. So we can switch to grid view and see all of the estimates. We can see South Bank tends to be more blue, and Inala tends to be more orange, indicating higher cancer rates. And if we change to thyroid cancer, you can see just how different the estimates are for that area. If we look at excess deaths, which is our measure of survival, it actually is also very, very different for each of those 2 areas. Now, excess deaths are although they're a survival measure, because they're on this kind of death scale, it means that a high value means it's actually better survival, lower survival. Let me get that right. Whereas a low value means it's actually higher survival. So blue is good and orange or red is bad in this case. That means here, Inala tends to have lower survival from cancer overall within 5 years of diagnosis, while South Bank tends to have higher survival. We also have these graphs in the left-hand side, which allow us to see an overview by different categories. And we have 3 different versions of that graph. And so if we change to remoteness, here we're looking at lung cancer. You can see that strong gradient by remoteness. We can also look at the remoteness and see there's very few areas categorized as remote, but the proportion bar allows us to clearly see the colors that are in those categories. We can additionally filter, and this is quite nice. So you can do it on a continuous scale based on the diagnoses. So we can literally just focus on the areas that are average or above average by going to 1. And we can change the probability. So we're only looking at areas that are considered to be different from the national average. You can see how both our map and our V-plot has changed to only show those areas. If we change the type of cancer, it actually keeps those filters in place. We can additionally take off the filter for diagnoses, and now we're going to capture every area that's considered to be different to the national average. But we can filter by categories too. So if we just want to focus on our remote areas, we can remove the other categories, and we can see for a lot of remote areas that are different to the national average, the melanoma tends to be lower, but there's some areas that are higher. This differs from head and neck cancers, because here every remote area that's considered to differ from the national average is actually above the national average in incidence rates. So these features are great for our investigators. They can dig in really deep. But wait, there are more features. So in our options menu, you can actually choose to see a PDF. So that will allow you to have a copy of the screenshot that you're viewing there. We can additionally choose to just share the exact view that we're looking at. And you can do that on social media, but I'll just open up another tab here. And one thing that I really like about this feature is that you don't just see the map that you're looking at, but it shows all the graphs that you also had open at the time. So you can give a very specific story around that. And so this is what the PDF looks like. So it's just 4 pages, bit of background information, and the actual screenshot that you wanted. We can also download all of the estimates that we have in the atlas. Just enter your email address. It'll say the email is sent, and your email looks like that. And you can just click on the link. So one feature that I think is quite unique to this atlas is the transparency toggle, which is down the bottom there. So the atlas actually has a pale yellow gradient overlay that is on by default. And it varies according to where it is positioned in that V-plot. So if it's right at the top of the V-plot, then it's completely translucent. But if it's right at the bottom, it's completely opaque pale yellow. And so if we actually look at what happens when we turn it off, you can see the colors just become that bit more vivid. So basically having it on is just incorporating how important the estimates really are and giving indication of their precision. So another feature that's nice is the tours. And we have a few different tours around models and methods, but also different cancer types. And so it actually talks you through the patterns and potential causes. It'll do different filtering options. It will just help you understand what's happening and potentially why. It'll look at diagnosis and also the excess deaths, so the survival measure, and do these different comparisons. And in our background container site, we have lots of details on the methods, the data, and some FAQs. So these features hopefully make the atlas really useful for everybody to use. In terms of key findings from the atlas, I think for me personally, I was just really surprised by the high levels of variation for some cancer types. So I was surprised by the head and neck variation. I was surprised by the liver cancer variation. And a lot of these you can see are quite high in the remote and especially northern areas of the country. Same for lung cancer. Melanoma, again, had very high variation, but quite a different pattern to the other cancers. And prostate cancer was also, esophageal as well, showed kind of that remoteness, high remoteness pattern. And prostate cancer showed quite a different pattern. In terms of the excess deaths, probably the strongest pattern was seen for all cancers. And you can see how it's often those remote and northern areas again that tend to have the lower survival here. You might be thinking that maybe it's because some of those cancers we saw before that have poor survival were more common in these areas, but this model has actually been adjusted for the different types of cancer. So this literally should not be driven by that. And I think it really is probably a bit unacceptable in a way to have these kind of huge differences in a country like Australia. So this brings us to, what does the results from the Atlas mean for you personally? This is the third and final part of this talk. So wave your hand if you have a device with you that has internet access. Keep your hand waving if you're able to go on this device without getting distracted by emails and social media. Okay, if your hand is still waving and you want to, you're welcome to pull out your devices and just play along with me in this part of the talk. So go to atlas.cancer.org.au/app. On the other hand, if you prefer to just watch me, you're welcome to do that as well. Wave your hand when you found it. Okay, great. We have quite a few people there. So that website is atlas.cancer.org.au/app. Great. So we'll move on. So if you want to choose potentially the area of your residence, on the other hand, I'm actually going to use Queenstown, which is not my area of residence, but an area I would not like to live, just for demonstration purposes. And you can zoom into your area, and then you can click on it just to get all the different results for that area. So for Queenstown, when I look at grid view, I see two very prominent cancer types with high incidence. One is head and neck cancer. It's 51% above the Australian average. One's esophageal, it's 47% above. So we're going to go with head and neck as the highest incident cancer in this area. So for people on their own devices, what are some of the highest cancer types in your area? Okay. Okay. So we have melanoma. It's huge. Any other cancer types anyone would like to yell out? Thyroid, okay, yeah. Yeah. So if we zoom in on Queenstown, just to have a look again, so you can see for head and neck cancers, it's like red and it's surrounded by lower incidence areas. They're still high, but they're not as high as Queenstown. Does this mean Queenstown has a cancer cluster? The answer is no, not at all. So a cancer cluster has a very specific definition. It needs a clearly defined cohort and a thorough investigation by the appropriate state or territory health department. So we cannot use the Australian Cancer Atlas to try to find cancer clusters because we don't have clearly defined cohorts. However, common risk factors for cancers, most cancers tend to be increasing age, but our models have adjusted for age. So no age differences between areas should be driving any of the patterns we see, either incidence or survival. So then what are some of the risk factors for head and neck cancer? Well, as we know, every cancer is a very distinct disease. So for the cancer types, some people mention melanoma. That has a tour in the Australian Cancer Atlas. So you could open that tour and see what it says the risk factors for melanoma are. For head and neck cancers, that is not a tour yet. So instead, you can do a Google search, and a really good website to find the different causes of cancer is actually Cancer Council. It has a huge range there, and it's a trusted, reputable source. And you can see for head and neck cancers, key risk factors are alcohol consumption and tobacco smoking. So does that mean, could we say that Queenstown potentially has high alcohol consumption and tobacco smoking? Excellent, people are shaking their heads. That's good. Because the other cancer that was really high incidence in this area was esophageal, and some of the causes for esophageal are also tobacco smoking and alcohol consumption. But even so, we cannot say this area has high risk factors, and there's two reasons why. So one is we're kind of assuming that the people living there that have been diagnosed with these cancers have lived there their entire life, which is probably unlikely to be true. Some of these people diagnosed while living in this area might have moved there a week earlier. The other thing is that it's assuming constant rates across time. So as we know, risk factors take a long time to be reflected in the cancer incidence rates. What we're saying is that there's been high rates of alcohol consumption for the last few decades, which we really don't know. So what we could say is that there's a possibility that people who live in this area may have in the past had high alcohol consumption or tobacco smoking, but even that is a bit dubious. There's obviously a lot of causes of these cancers and a lot of reasons why they could be happening. So I'll now look at, just something different, low incidence cancer. And the reason for doing this is because just as we can't say, oh, this area has high risk, therefore I'm at high risk or I'm not at high risk, it's really based on your own personal risk factors. You can look at the low incidence cancers to just see what the risk factors are and see if you're at risk for any of those, because even if your area is low risk, you could personally be at high risk. And so the causes of thyroid cancer are kind of things that are genetic or thyroid conditions or exposure to certain types of radiation. So these are things that are not really modifiable at all. And people think maybe some of the reasons for the variation we're seeing in thyroid cancer incidence is because of differences in clinical detection. If we look at the excess deaths, then I'm going to pick the highest excess mortality. Sadly, Queenstown actually doesn't have any areas that are blue for survival. So it's all average or above average, meaning low survival or average survival. And you can see Queenstown's not faring as poorly as some areas in Australia. But what are some of the potential reasons for differences in cancer survival? So it's actually quite common among different cancers. So it's things like the stage of diagnosis, the treatment the patient receives, even the follow-up support, and patient factors like their age, their lifestyle, and different comorbidities that they have. So we have adjusted for age in these models. That will not be driving any differences that we're seeing. But of these, the single greatest factor that influences whether you survive cancer or not is the cancer stage of diagnosis. And that's because if you diagnose cancer early, then the treatment's a lot more effective. So I had a feeling there was one other thing I wanted to say on that point, but I can't think what it was. So where are we going with the atlas? Oh, I know. So really, I think it's, in terms of the atlas and you, it's not like you can look at it to determine your personal risk factors, but it can help you, it can help motivate you to identify risk factors you might like to change. So I think that's the power of the atlas for someone applying it to themselves. So where's the atlas going in the future? Well, we're wanting to include additional cancer types. We're going to include some additional indicators. Currently it's diagnosis or incidence and excess deaths or survival, but we're going to include some screening information and also some treatment information. We're going to include additional years so people can actually see how things are changing over time. We've been working with New Zealand Ministry of Health to help them develop their own New Zealand Cancer Atlas. And we're going to include some additional tours. Ultimately, hopefully every cancer type that's in the atlas will actually have its own tour. So I hope this presentation has shown you why I believe the Australian Cancer Atlas is actually one of the best cancer atlases in the world. I hope you also learned a little bit about cancer and its risk factors, and you're always welcome to contact us anytime you have any questions or potential ideas of collaboration with the atlas. So thank you so much for your attention.